All right, good afternoon. Thanks for attending today's webinar focused on decoding 2025 general rate increases. We're going to spend the first 25 minutes going through the content and reserve the last 10 minutes for questions. If you have any questions throughout, please use the Q&A function to drop those in the chat, and we'll address those at the end of today's webinar. I'd like to take a moment to give you a quick overview of who we are. We're the shipping and logistics arm of SIB, known as Shipware. We're highly connected and experienced experts dedicated to empowering our clients by optimizing operations, reducing costs, and creating value. We enable our clients to reclaim their time, enabling them for growth, and enabling them to drive their success and continued growth. SIB is a platform focused on helping ensure our clients never overpay across a number of spend categories, everything from telecom to SaaS to today's focus, shipping. As I mentioned, we're going to kick things off with our team of experts focusing on helping you navigate through the upcoming 2025 parcel GRIs. Let me introduce you to our Shipware team. My name is Luke Larson. I'm a national account executive here at Shipware. Joining me is Matt Samowski, our Director of Sales, Matt Bond, Director of Carrier Mix Optimization, Adi Kiramchetti, Senior Parcel Consultant, and Paul Yausi, Senior Director, Parcel Consulting. Matt Bond, what can shippers expect to see as we go into 2025?
Thanks, Luke. Well, as the title of the slide suggests, there's a new year and, as usual, new rates. The national carriers this year have been in line with their previous increases over the last few, which were anywhere between 5.9 to 6.9 increases. They're holding steady to that this year. This year also, most of the individual service levels at UPS and FedEx are all right around that 5.9% increase for the most part, which is a departure from last year where we saw overnight air services experience a larger than announced increase. The Postal Service this year has a lower GRI for their priority mail and for their ground advantage services than the nationals, but we are seeing a 9.2% increase for Parcel Select. Now, this is really a part of the Post Office attempt to get more shipments directly in-house with them, as opposed to routing through alternatives like postal consolidators. And we do know that in 2025, there will be some consolidators that no longer offer ounce-based discounts that we've been used to in the past. In terms of alternative carriers, they're mostly in line with FedEx and UPS this year. On Track and DHL are a couple of examples we've shown here. Their increases are very similar, and they still remain excellent options to diversify away from the nationals. Here we're looking at service level increases by both, or by weight and service, excuse me. And it's important really to understand how your specific package distribution can affect your overall bottom line, since the national carriers don't make their increases linearly. In 2025 at UPS, two-day shippers, higher weight ground commercial and residential shippers will generally see a higher than announced increase. And it's similar at FedEx. The only difference there really is that three-day shippers are also going to see a bit higher increase as well. Next day air is mostly flat or in line with those announced increases. This service has really been mostly flat for the carriers over the last year or so, which is most likely why the increases are not quite as punitive as some of the other services.
And Matt, this is Paul Yausi. Just wanted to chime in really quick. As a reminder to our audience, please utilize the ability to ask questions by typing them into the box on your screen if you have any questions for us. And Matt, we did have a question come in so far, and it's asking about why do you think the second day and the higher weight ground shipments are higher than the announced 5.9% increase?
Yeah, so the higher weight ground, we're going to get into some of the details on that, specifically around the surcharges, which these generally apply to. But the higher weight packages are oftentimes less attractive to the nationals and to alternative carriers due to their weight and size. They're often difficult to handle, and most carriers some carriers will experience issues with their network with those. So there really is just a lot less competition for those packages, and it enables FedEx and UPS to capture a bit more profit when they do handle them. Alternatively, or conversely, the lighter weight shipments are the ones that are generally the most competitive within the marketplace. So there's alternatives, or rather incentive, for FedEx and UPS to try to retain those. On the 2-day side, there are a lot of e-commerce shippers that are in maybe not direct competition with Amazon, but their customers often will try to hold them to the Amazon standard. So if those shippers and customers of FedEx and UPS are required to get a 2-day shipment out because their customers demand it, FedEx and UPS have a little bit more leg room to increase those services, basically due to that Amazon effect.
Great, thanks.
So the devil is always in the details with these GRI increases. And here we're going to look at the surcharges. The surcharges we're seeing here are the UPS surcharges, but FedEx's and their corresponding increases are similar. The surcharges are often and generally where we will find the hidden GRI. This year is definitely no exception there. Basically, every common surcharge will increase significantly more than that 5.9%. And as usual, as is typical of the last few years now, shippers of large packages will be severely impacted again with this increase, specifically around additional handling and large package surcharges, both of which are increasing over 26% year over year. And really 20% plus increases have been the trend for those large package type surcharges for a few years now. We expect that to continue into the future because, as we said before, there really isn't a lot of alternative for these. The other thing we'd like to point out here, and then we'll talk a little bit more later on as well about, is the minimum billable weight has been added specifically to additional handling length on the dimension side. So if you have a 9-pound package, it gets hit with that surcharge, it's going to be rated as a 40-pound package, which is new. Last thing I'll point out here is that while it's not quite as large an increase as additional handling and oversize, the ground residential increase this year is nearly 8%, and the DAS surcharges is anywhere from 6.3 to 9.2% for ground services. These two are the ones that most shippers do get hit with the most frequently. So these are always going to be candidates for the carriers to increase higher than announced moving forward as well.
Thanks, Matt. And I just had another question come in regarding this page as well. So this person is asking, why do you think we're seeing a 26% plus increase year over year for additional handling and large package or oversized fees?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it comes down to alternatives. There are not a lot of alternative carriers, and even the nationals themselves don't really like to ship a lot of these types of packages. We find that FedEx often is a little bit more accepting of the heavier shipments, the additional handling rather, and the oversized shipments than UPS is. But really, they're costly for the carriers to serve. There aren't a lot of alternatives. So if they are going to handle them, they do want to get this premium, which we've seen really over the last 3 years now.
Thanks, Matt. And a quick note for my teammates really quick. The questions are coming faster than I'm able to see them. So if you see some questions that are relevant, please go ahead and bring those up. I might have missed them. But with that being said, I'll move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Paul. So one of the things Matt just mentioned in the title of the previous slide is why 5.9% isn't 5.9%. And one of the things we see is, and one of the things we've overlooked in this discussion is that the carriers have already won. We are talking about a forced rate increase that occurs at the beginning of every year. They are getting their rate increase. You probably can't do that to your clients, and there's probably very few vendors who can do that to you every single year at the same time. In fact, this year, UPS has their rate increase going into place December 23rd, so in less than 2 weeks. FedEx is going to stick to early January, but UPS has moved that up. So again, be aware of that if you're not. One of the things we do for our clients is the GRI analysis. We can take their existing rates. Once the carriers announce their increase, again, which is 5.9%, we can then take that information and project what the impact is going to be to our clients. So in the case of the first client listed, a national safety equipment manufacturer, if you look, to the far right, you'll see increased percentage where you'll see the number 5.8%. So a little below the 5.9% average that the carriers announced. Right below that, though, you'll see surcharges increasing at a rate of 7.2% for a total increase of 6.3%. If you've budgeted an increase based on the 5.9 they told you about, your numbers are already off. This whole scenario, as far as what the GRI is and how it impacts you, is very dependent on your package profile. That's the size of your packages, how far you're shipping them, where you're shipping them. All of these things impact what is going to be happening here. Also, the services you saw on the previous slide, Matt talked about different services getting different increases, particularly at different weight breaks. In this second example, we have a national graphic and signage designer. When you hear signage, the first thing you probably do think of is that these might be bigger and bulkier. That is, in fact, what we are seeing here. Base rate increase of 6.3%, again, above the 5.9% average. Surcharge increase of 9.9%. Most folks are thinking in terms of that 5.9% increase. We're at 7.1% overall. Again, significant impact. If you have not calculated this correctly, you're going to be under budget or over budget regarding your spend on parcel shipping. The last example we have is the national manufacturer of truck accessories. First thing that jumps out on the surcharge is a 15.8% increase. You saw on the previous slide that the surcharges with the biggest increase were the handling fees and the oversized fees. In fact, on that chart, which you may or may not have noticed, there were only 3 surcharges that were at the 5.9% increase or below. The vast majority of them were over the 5.9 and significantly so. And again, this is something you have to be hyper aware of.
And Audie, before we move on, see a question here that came in, and it's asking about our examples are showing rate increases close or slightly above the 5.9 on the base rates. Do we ever see folks that are taking less than the announced 5.9 GRI?
Yeah, great question. In fact, we do. There are things you can do to manage this. First, though, be aware, again, the carriers have won this fight. You're going to take a rate increase. You might be able to get it lower than the 5.9%. There are things you can do. That's one of the services we provide when we're assisting customers negotiating their contracts, but you're going to take a rate increase. You can mitigate it to some degree. On the surcharges, much harder to do that. You can get some help there, but the carriers are much more reluctant to give any kind of support on restricting the increase on the surcharges. That's oftentimes where they make up for concessions they've given you on your base rate charges. They'll get it back with increases on the surcharges.
Great, thanks.
So in 2025, we're going to see the carriers do multiple things. One of the things they do, which is particularly problematic, is you'll sign an agreement with them, but most of these agreements are one-way agreements. You're going to have to comply to the terms in the agreement. The carriers are not. They're going to have increases that occur throughout the year. The first one we're going to be talking about is fuel. Paul, I'm going to let you go ahead and get into more detail on that.
Sure, thanks, Audie. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is how much fuel has changed in the past 5 years and how much the carriers use it as a revenue generator. So if we look at this chart here, in July of 2020, we have a sample package here that costs $10 to ship. And in 2020, the ground fuel surcharge was 6%. So they paid the shipper paid 60 cents for fuel when fuel cost $2.39. And this is the important part here. With that 60 cents, FedEx was able to purchase a quarter of a gallon of diesel with that surcharge fee that you paid them. Parenthetically, I seriously doubt that it cost FedEx a quarter of a gallon of diesel to make that delivery for you. But if we skip ahead the next 5 years with normal GRIs of 4.9 in 21, 5.9 in 22, 6.9 in 23, and we skip to this year, that same package now costs $12.58 to ship as a base rate, which is a 26% increase. But due to all of the changes in fuel matrix that the carriers have made, that package now has a fuel surcharge of $2.04. And that is a 241% increase in fuel surcharge, which leads us to this very important part here. Now, that one package is paying over a half of a gallon of diesel fuel, and you're paying that for FedEx. Clearly, this is something, if you listen to carrier earnings calls, we do regularly. It's one of the things that both carriers talk about very often, that fuel is a lever that they can pull at any point for margin and revenue generation. And they're telling us this here. And if you recall way back to around 2006, 2007, fuel was first introduced as a pass-through because fuel costs had risen. But here we are 15 years later, paying exorbitant prices in fuel. But with that being said, I wanted to go ahead and kick it over to Matt Samowski, who wanted to talk about additional handling and other changes.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. So while you're pulling that up there, and if you want to just click on that slide there, Paul, and get right into it. To Matt Bond's earlier point to the audience, the devil's really in the details, and things like additional handling and surcharges are no different. So looking at this slide, focusing on the left side and the left chart, back in 2022 for a ground package qualifying for additional handling on dimensions going to zone 3, the published rate in 2022 was $17.50. As you could see, year over year, it's went up an increase between 17% and really 26%. But if you focus on the actual increase number since 2022, on the bottom, as you could see, it's went up a total of 77% since 2022. And really, on the left side here, this is a shipper who, let's assume, has had the same discount on this specific surcharge throughout the life of these increases. Now, moving over to the right chart, it's obviously showing the same increase in the published charge year over year, but this is a shipper who, let's say, negotiates this specific surcharge and their discount yearly. As you can see, they're getting 5% incremental improvement year over year on the discount. So at the end of the day, their year over year increase works out to be between 9 and 17%, with the 2022 compounding increase of 41%. So as you can see, it's still a relatively massive increase, but really the takeaway of this slide is the carriers are going to continue to do these increases and stay ahead of this. Shippers need to be due diligent in understanding where those charges are drastically affecting their spend and make sure that they're negotiating on those massive impact areas to ensure that they keep pace with the carrier increases. Now, everything on that slide was really just focusing on the rate itself. And I know a question came in earlier around some of the additional handling changes. Prior to October of this year, essentially, if a package qualified for additional handling related to dimensions, it would simply work off the actual rated weight of the package, meaning the higher of the scale weight versus the dimensional weight. Now, in October of 2024, UPS specifically moved those goalposts. So walking through an example here, this package that we're looking at weighs 5 pounds on a scale, and the dimensions are 50 by 8 by 4. So that 50-inch side being the length makes this package qualify for additional handling, considering the longest side is over 48 inches. Prior to October, looking on the left side here, the dimensional weight of this package, if this shipper had a 194 dim divisor, would work out to about 8.25. And considering the scale weight is 5 pounds, this package would have been billed as a 9-pound package. Looking at the individual charges, this was a ground package going to zone 3. It qualified for additional handling. It was also residential, and you had a 16.5% fuel totaling $52.66. This same package shipped after UPS made this change in October is no longer going to be billed or rated as a 9-pound package. Because it qualifies for those additional handling dimensions, UPS is automatically going to assess this as a 40-pound billable weight package. So focusing on just the specific zone 3 charge, as you can see, that moves from $15.05 up to $31 for a 105% increase before you even look at any of the actual charges. So really focusing on this chart on the bottom right, this same package shipped over the course of maybe one different week is going to be looking at roughly about a 51% increase, all said and done, based on UPS moving that scale of that minimum build weight on these qualifying packages. So, Paul, the next slide is going to really go a little bit deeper into some of these hidden increases. It's all relatively the same message around additional handling, But another way that the carriers hide these increases on top of just the actual cost increases are the frequency that charges occur. So we just looked at an example with additional handling where UPS moved the goalposts and the billable weight of the package. Another way this happens is with adding and removing zip codes to what's considered delivery area surcharge. So looking at this recent announcement here, initially to the eye, it looks like a good change for shippers. UPS removed more zip codes than it added. What you need to consider, though, is the population of the zip codes that are being added versus removed. So on the surface, it looks great that UPS removed zip codes qualifying from additional for delivery area surcharge compared to adding more. But when you look at the actual zip codes that are being added versus what's being removed, the amount of population that's being added into this classification is a much, much larger number than what's being removed. So essentially, when you couple this with a rate increase happening, it's essentially a double dip. They're increasing the rates of the actual charge, and then they're increasing the frequency of occurrence of the charge to essentially increase profits across the board. So with that, Adi, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I think one of the key points, and we've got a couple other items to highlight, there's a significant amount of complexity. Even if you have your pricing agreement, you're not going to see these changes. You're not going to have a way to figure out they're going to impact you. Even if you are looking at their service guide, this information may be in there, but it's going to be buried. It's going to be very difficult for you to see and find out until they start these charges to show up on your bill. And even then, oftentimes it's only going to be inferred. A couple other changes coming up, zone realignment. Basically, they charge two ways based on the weight of the package and the distance it travels. Now they're going to reassess those zones and readjust them so they can charge you more. There is an existing demand and peak surcharge. They called it peak first because it was only supposed to be seasonal. They're changing the name to demand so that they can charge it more frequently. What they're also going to do, they create a number of different gates and targets where it will apply or not apply to you. They don't make it very clear on how that's going to work. So you won't know until it starts happening in most cases. Also, if you are shipping with UPS now, they are charging a 2% surcharge if you're paying your bill with credit cards. You should be aware of that. If you're not, that's something you'll want to address with your carrier rep. If you have a UPS Go Brown agreement, which most people got in about August of 2023, that was in response to UPS's concerns clients had over a potential UPS strike. So to get business back, they gave out very aggressive agreements. Many of the surcharge reductions or waivers they gave in that Go Brown agreement have expired. Again, they have not told their customers about this. The point being, you're not going to know on a lot of these changes.
And finally, we'll wrap up with some changes with the post office, which we talked about a bit earlier. They are making big changes to their consolidator relationships. And like I mentioned, we do know that some of the consolidators will no longer offer ounce-based discounts. So previously this year, the prior year, and all years before, postal consolidators were inducting their packages into the destination delivery unit, or the DDU. Essentially, this is the closest facility to the customer. And in the past, the consolidators had discounts in their negotiated service agreements with the post office, which I'll refer to as NSAs, to induct their packages into the DDU. They were able to offer their shippers and their customers deep discounts as a result. Well, next year, the post office will no longer be offering these DDU discounts by way of the consolidator NSAs, and they'll have to induct into the local processing centers, or the LPCs. This is further away from the customer doorstep, so we would expect changes to occur as a result, and certainly higher prices. Again, the post office is doing this really to support their initiative to build out their Ground Advantage product primarily, and also a little bit of priority mail. And we have seen shippers start to use Ground Advantage quite a bit as a result, and we expect that to continue moving forward. We've also seen the post office become far more interested, at least at a preliminary level, and aggressive in working on NSAs with individual shippers, and definitely more so than they had been in the past. A lot of the agreements that we would see years ago would come with difficult to hit customer commitments, similar to what you would see in a FedEx and UPS agreement. The difference being that they would enforce them, and we would often see pricing losses when those commitments weren't hit. They were often difficult to attain as well. Now we're starting to see tiered agreements similar to FedEx and UPS. So we think that that suggests and certainly aligns with what they've been talking about as a willingness to go to the consumer directly. One other question that came up in the chat, which we'll jump ahead a little bit to the Q&A, is providing more detail around the post office not doing final mile for discounted UPS and FedEx services. They will still continue to do some of that. One thing that came out on that really hits the UPS side a bit harder is that they're trying to do away with the dual labels so that the USPS or UPS could do that final mile. And a lot of times what would happen was the post office would get the least attractive items and UPS would keep the things that fit their network the best. UPS is trying to bring these mostly in-house if they can and does not want to have a dual label moving forward. FedEx mostly does their ground economy in-house already. It's really hard to gauge exactly what the post office handles, but it is a much smaller portion. In terms of what to expect with your parcel pricing next year, well, we think that things are going to tighten up a bit. We think one of the ways they might do this is to somewhat artificially, but also really reduce capacity within their own networks by doing things like grounding planes as an example. But really that could help justify a tightening pricing marketplace because we've heard during COVID the capacity is tight, now capacity is loosening. We think that there could be some tightening there to increase price. We've already talked a lot about new surcharges. We think that that's going to continue. Rebranding demand, new demand residential charge. FedEx introduced ground economy delivery and returns charge. We talked about the billable weight for additional handling. These things are going to persist. And it's imperative that you be cognizant of this year round at this point. And finally, we've already started to see a little bit of this, but we do expect stronger commitment language and or termination language in contracts. In the past, again, carriers have somewhat left it open to interpretation. Things like we have the right to enforce this is the tone of some of that language. Now it's becoming much more strict. If you do not hit this commitment, you will be assessed this fee. So they're trying to hang on to as much volume as they can. They're doing it through a bunch of different ways, contractually as well. So we'd like to thank everybody for your time and for your attention today. We'd like to also open it up for Q&A in just a second. But as we mentioned before, if you'd like to see how your data specifically is affected by this GRI, we'd be happy to perform a complimentary impact analysis for you and also provide a benchmark assessment by one of our consulting teams so that you can understand really how your rates stack up within the marketplace and also any opportunities that might be available.
Thanks, Matt. We had a few questions come in as well as some in advance. First, and it pairs well with Britt's question in the chat. I know there's a lot of information here. What, if anything, would you prioritize in a negotiation? With that, Britt was mentioning, he's got DAS additional handling charges applying to essentially all of his packages. What's the best way to mitigate those? And is there something shippers should focus on, one surcharge versus another?
Yeah, I could take this. I would say the first step really, and it sounds like you do have a handle on a lot of your high occurrence surcharges. That's a good starting place for sure, especially now that you hopefully better understand a little bit how those increases will affect you moving forward. But I think that the most important thing is to come armed with data and facts, right? So if you can understand what your increase is going to look like, you understand how that is in relation to the GRI, and you've already pointed out the residential, the DAS, the additional handling, all have been increased by more. Those are all great ammunition points to go forward with. The other thing that we would probably suggest is, and you've already kind of done this, is to hit on those bigger ticket items, which isn't necessarily what has increased the most, but what you're shipping the most of. So if you don't have a lot of additional handling, but it is a 20% increase, maybe that's not an area that you would want to focus on, and maybe you'd rather try to make hay on the residential surcharge as an example. So really understand how each individual charge impacts your specific increase and go from there. So target those items first. It doesn't have to necessarily be what increased the most.
Thanks, Matt. Another question we had in advance: is there a best time to negotiate with the carriers?
Yeah, I'll take this one. I think any time is a good time to negotiate. Right now, the environment is particularly good. Both carriers need volume. It is much more a shipper's market than it used to be. Since COVID, they both had a big advantage. That advantage has declined. They need volume, particularly UPS. Their earnings call lately have been weak. They've indicated, again, a dependence on lower margin volume. So there's some opportunity there.
Thanks, Adi.
Also, just to piggyback off of that, if you do see poor earnings, if they talk about things like Adi mentioned, a need for additional revenue, additional packages, those can often be indicators of a loosening pricing environment.
Yeah, and related to that, make sure you get your pricing agreement from your carrier reps. Ask them each, whether it's UPS or FedEx, ask for it, understand it, see what's expiring, what may be out of whack, how old it is. A lot of the times we work with clients, they have agreements that are 4 or 5 years old, very dated.
And I'll actually add a little bit to that as well. Make them go over your actual agreement with you. What a tactic we see very often is sales reps like to use PowerPoints to present to you. And when they do that, they're only highlighting the things they want you to see. So it's really important to know the terms and conditions and all of the fine print in your 30-page document, agreement that you have with the carrier. It's really important to make them focus on all of the details rather than the ones that they want you to look at, because it highlights the good things they've done for you.
Yeah, and on this panel for Shipward, you've got 3 former carrier reps, 2 from UPS, 1 from FedEx. I'm the FedEx guy. These are absolutely things we would do. We wouldn't show you information if it wasn't favorable to us.
Paul, you brought up a great point here that segues into a question we just got. Does my rep understand these things, or is this a deeper conversation with the carrier?
Yeah, I could take that. So prior to my work here today at Ship, where I was a UPS rep, as was Luke Larson, your reps, depending on their level of experience or seniority, typically do not understand the level of granularity into the general rate increases or any of these increases. That's why they typically, to Paul's point, will lean on the PowerPoints and kind of lean on the actual average of 5.9%. They are well aware that the increase itself is higher than 5.9%, but the math behind it is really pulled behind the corporate and pricing strings. So the reps are really the face of this increase and kind of the message itself, but they do not understand the actual impact on their clients. So if you ask them for any kind of forecasting information or whatnot, you will typically get a very simplified answer, similar to what Adi discussed earlier around that average increase of your spend this year, forecasting above 5.9% next year. So I definitely recommend working either with an outside expert related to this, an in-house data team, whatever that might be. But it's a very granular analysis to truly be able to understand what that actual impact is going to look like.
The previous slide we showed on all of those things, they're increasing fuel, DAS, the 40-pound charge, all of that. If you ask your rep about it, they're unlikely to know in detail how it works, and they definitely do not want to have the conversation with you.
Hey, Luke, I had a quick question come in, and it was really generic, but it's kind of pointed. And it basically says, you guys shared with me a lot of information regarding the hidden cost increases. And in short, how the heck do they get away with this?
They get away with this because there's 2 things going on. I think everybody assumes you have to ship with FedEx or UPS. They're the only 2 that are national carriers. That's what you think. Post office is a national carrier. We don't typically get asked about that. The other thing that causes people to pause, you have spending targets on your UPS or your FedEx agreement. If you start moving or splitting volume, you're going to impact those targets. You don't know how much volume you can move. It is a scarier thing to make change. We also see that a lot. Most of the folks we work with prefer to stay with the carrier, their existing carrier, not change. The most savings you get is typically if you'll move. We would encourage you to consider other options, not be sworn to FedEx or UPS. That is definitely one of the reasons the market doesn't change as quickly as we'd like.
You know, Paul and Luke, I think one question that is pretty interesting, and I think on point here that came in is, do these inflated charges help me in a way to get better discounts because more money is going to my earned discount tiers? I was around, actually typing something out, but I think it's worth discussing. Not necessarily. It would seem like that, right? Because on the earned discounts, it's working off of the gross or published rate, and then ultimately where your rolling average or tier is based on that. But what a lot of shippers don't realize, and more carrier reps themselves don't realize it, is not all of your gross charges go into your earned discount or your rolling average. So it's not as simple as saying, here's all my gross spend, let me divide that by 52 weeks and figure out where I'd land. A lot of these surcharges that we were looking at earlier that take these year-over-year increases much higher than 5.9% do not actually help you in terms of your earned discounts and achieving higher tiers. So at the end of the day, those increases will not necessarily net you better discounts.
Related to those surcharges, way in the past, what they would do is they would give you a fixed dollar amount. You will pay $1 for a residential surcharge. That'd be on the agreement. Now they give you a percent. The reason they give you a percentage is so you will pay the increase. You'll get a reduction off of a higher fee. So they're still getting money back each year. That's another thing to keep out. These agreements are structured to favor them in the way they operate.
Other thing I just want to mention on earned discounts, because we do see this a lot. Earned discounts, at least in my opinion, I think a lot of the other people's opinion on the shipware side of this call, seem like a way to incentivize shippers to bring on more business, when I think in reality, what they're actually doing is committing shippers to a specific amount of business with the carrier, specifically and especially with UPS, where we'll see UPS designate a specific amount of business. If you don't hit that, the next tier below is quite punitive. Whereas if you increase by even say 100% in some cases, you might only get half a point in discount. So really, in my opinion, the earned discounts are more a way to commit you to UPS or FedEx rather than incentivize you to bring more to FedEx and to UPS.
And I know we're coming up on time here, guys, but there was a couple of questions on alternative carriers. Matt, I'll throw this question at you. How do I get started with non-traditional carriers? And segueing into that, is Amazon shipping an effective alternative?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is there are a lot of options, and we can certainly help you with those. But again, it's important to understand what you're shipping. So if you're a lightweight shipper, especially, there's probably going to be a lot of options for you. But it also depends on how much you're shipping. So if you're shipping, say, 1,000 packages a day, I do think that there's going to be a lot of attractiveness and a lot of potential cost savings and even service improvements looking at a postal consolidator or a regional carrier. If you're smaller on the e-commerce side and you're a FedEx shipper, it might be worth looking at some discounted postal rates which are available for again, the smaller shippers. And those can be available through various platforms. We have ways to offer those into TMS systems. Ultimately, if you're just with FedEx and UPS and looking to branch out, I would say, depending on volume, you're best off looking at a platform with the post office and or regional consolidator plays if you're a larger shipper. On the Amazon side, they're probably quite a ways out from being able to offer any real shipping solution at scale to shippers that are looking to have Amazon as an option. I think Amazon is being selective on who they invite into their shipping umbrella right now. Some of the other guys might have a bit more insight than I do specifically on Amazon, but I would say that we'll expect them to pick up market share from FedEx and UPS traditional shippers moving forward, but we do think it'll be rolled out on a pretty selective basis, which is what we've seen in the past.
And I can add just a little bit more color to that for you, Matt, on Amazon. Right now, Amazon is in 15 metro markets, representing about 30% of the population. So they are an excellent alternative for the right shipper, as Matt was mentioning, as long as your origins and destinations are within those 30 or 15 metro markets or that 30% of the population. They are a great alternative. And experts in the field are predicting that within the next 5 years, Amazon shipping should be fully national, covering the entirety of the country. And what we've seen so far, and I know a couple of teammates have helped facilitate Amazon shipping with a couple of clients, what we've seen so far is really attractive rates with little to no surcharges in place, at least for now.
It looks like that's all of our questions, and we're coming up on time here. We appreciate everyone joining us today. As a reminder, please feel free to contact us for a complimentary GRI impact analysis and benchmarking assessment of your data, so you can see how things stack up and what 2025 is going to look like for you. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll have a recording of this webinar available in the coming days.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.